Hi, my name is Aaron Steele. I'm a volunteer at the Field Museum in the O'Connor Lab, currently working to get some experience before I go into grad school as I'm a recent undergraduate.
Hi, my name is Jingmai O'Connor, and I'm the Associate Curator of Fossil Reptiles here at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. And of course, paleontology or fossil reptiles is quite broad. So within that, my focus is avian dinosaurs, like how avian dinosaurs evolved and how they became the incredibly specialized and diverse group that we see alive today. Avian dinosaurs are birds. So birds is a group, the scientific name for the group is aves, or some people say aviale. And the birds that are alive today all belong to a group called Neornithes. So they're all neornithine birds. But birds are living dinosaurs.
So, why birds specifically?
Yeah, why birds? Well, I think it's because birds are incredibly fascinating. And also, I guess a little bit has to do with the timing. When I went to graduate school, there were a lot of really important fossil birds coming out of China. So it seemed like a really good area to like an area of research with a lot of growth that I could really make a contribution to. So my research on fossil birds basically can be summarized into three different major areas. So one is, how did this group that we call birds emerge from theropod dinosaurs? So sometimes I say this, I describe this as the dinosaur bird transition, but that's not really accurate because birds are dinosaurs. It's not like they transitioned away from being dinosaurs, but it's like, how do you go from something that we call just a dinosaur to something like a non-avian dinosaur, a not bird dinosaur, to like bird dinosaurs? So how did that evolve? Like, which group of dinosaurs are birds most closely related to or even belong to? So that's one major area of research. And then another is, not specific to birds themselves, but it's how did flight evolve in dinosaurs? So when I started grad school, the idea, like, how do birds evolve from among theropod dinosaurs and how does flight evolve in theropod dinosaurs were thought to be essentially the same research question. But during the period of time that I've been a paleontologist, we've actually come to hypothesize that maybe flight evolved like 3, 4, even maybe 5 times in dinosaurs. So I do research to understand all these different forms of flight, because every time flight evolves, it evolves slightly differently, right? And then the third area of my research is to understand how you go from the earliest birds, which basically don't look like any birds alive today, to the birds that we see alive today. So birds are reptiles. And I mean, that's crazy. We don't think about that because birds are the most physiologically modified group of amniotes, that is land vertebrates on our planet. And they're so modified that we didn't even recognize that they were reptiles until like a couple decades ago, right? So I try to, do research to figure out when these different specializations, like their hot-bloodedness, their very high metabolic rates, or their rapid, growth and very like shortened developmental strategy, all these unique features of birds, like when did these biological features evolve? And this is actually really important because birds are the one group of dinosaurs that survived the end Cretaceous mass extinction. So why do they survive? And I think that it is some of their physiological modifications that permitted them to survive. So I think that paleontologists who are working on the selectivity of mass extinctions are gathering data that is so important and relevant to modern times, because now we are experiencing the 6th mass extinction, the Anthropocene mass extinction. So understanding how different groups of organisms, depending on their biology or ecology or their range, or all these different aspects of a species, like understanding how these things affect a group's ability to survive during mass extinction events, is information that is directly relevant to our current crisis and can guide conservation efforts and help us to at least mitigate like the effects of this mass extinction. So this mass extinction is happening. Climate change has happened, will continue to happen. We can't stop it. But we can, if we take action now, we can at least use information from the past to save some of what remains.
I see. And you mentioned that the physiological traits of birds helped them to survive this, like Cretaceous mass mass extinction, what were some of those physiological traits?
So the thing is, the late Cretaceous fossil record, so the birds that lived right before the extinction, like we have barely any fossils that tell us about what these birds were like. So the fossils I work on are actually much older. They're about 130 to 120 million years old. So for example, if we see that like modifications to the digestive system were present in early Cretaceous birds, then we can like cross that off the list as one of the reasons why birds survived, because we can tell it appeared much, much earlier. So when it comes to actually what the features were that let them survive, like I can tell you it wasn't their digestive efficiency. It wasn't their rapid growth, because like most living birds grow to adult size in like a couple weeks to a couple months. They just grow super fast. But we know that appears in the early Cretaceous, so we can cross that out. In terms of what it actually might be, it's more educated guess because we don't have the fossils. So one innovation that we think actually might help explain the selectivity has to do with a specialization in living bird eggs. So if you look at the egg of a crocodile, they don't like, so birds have this membrane called chelysa that hold the yolk in place in the center of the egg. And so this isn't present in crocodilians, which are also archosaur reptiles, so they belong to the same group of reptiles as birds, but they don't have these membranes. So basically the yolk or the developing embryo will adhere to the top of the egg. So if the egg is sitting like this, it'll like, it's hard to like do, like if the egg is like this, the embryo will like develop, like will stick to the egg right here, the eggshell, and just start growing. This means that if you move the egg after the embryo has started to grow, you kill it, because when you rotate it, you're completely shifting the physics that are happening on that embryo inside the egg, and it will kill it. But with birds, the chelysa holds the developing embryo in place in the middle of the egg. So that means you can move eggs after the embryo has begun to develop. And so this is important for a bunch of reasons. One, it means that the incubation time is reduced, because you're like, basically when you rotate the egg, you're stirring up the egg white, the albumin, and this is the proteins that feed the egg, the developing embryo. So basically it can absorb proteins faster, which means that the embryo can grow faster. So like crocodilians, like they have to, stay inside their eggs for like, I think it's like 3 months. It's like a really long period of time. But birds, it's much faster. So that's like one advantage, because when you're in an egg, you're helpless, right? So if you reduce the amount of time that you're vulnerable, because you're in an egg, but also because your parent has to sit on the nest and also be vulnerable, like that's advantageous. But also, if an egg can be moved after development has begun, you can recover a clutch. So this was actually shown when Mount St. Helens erupted. Birds were able to dig out their eggs and like still recover those clutches that were buried by the volcanic ash. So you can imagine in the environmental disaster that ensued, the impact of a giant bolide with our planet in what is today the Yucatan Peninsula, that like all this rain of like a fire and acid rain and all these things, if you could recover dig out your clutch and recover it, that would have been really important for the survival of a species, right? So that's one hypothesis. We know that non-avian dinosaurs closely related to birds, and also some Cretaceous birds embedded their eggs in the dirt. So we think that means that the eggs aren't being moved if they're kind of stuck in there, right? So we think that if the eggs aren't being moved, they probably don't have a chelysa. So it's like, if we don't have any direct evidence, or we're never going to have a fossilized chelysa, but we can, based on nest structure, we can make this hypothesis. So that's just one example. Others have to do with how good at flying certain groups of birds are, because I have to be clear, one group of birds survives the end Cretaceous mass extinction, but just because birds survive doesn't mean that birds were not also affected by this mass extinction event. So there were lots of birds that do go extinct, and one group of birds that survives, but it's not like one species survives. It's a bunch of different species all belonging to one group. So what did they all have in common? What physiological advantages did members of this group have above that put them at an advantage to other groups of birds, but also non-avian dinosaurs. So, yeah, so, because the Neanderthals had eggs that were embedded in the ground, we can maybe hypothesize that's one reason they went extinct. But yeah, fossilized nests are super rare, so it's just a hypothesis. But the fact is, like, we really don't know, which is why this is such an interesting area of research.
You mentioned the Enantiornithines as another group of birds that did not survive the late Cretaceous mass extinction. And you also mentioned that flight has evolved in birds and in dinosaurs multiple times. So is there a particular group of birds you specialize in with your research?
My PhD is on Enantiornithine. So, when I got started, that was the group that I was really an expert on. They're the dominant group of terrestrial birds in the Cretaceous. So this basically means that if you're in a terrestrial depositional environment, so this means like not a marine environment, and you find a fossil bird and it's Cretaceous age, like chances are it's going to be an Enantiornithine. And so they account for half of all the birds that we know of from the Mesozoic. Half of the species are Enantiornithines. But they're all small birds that seem to have lived in trees. So I kind of make the analogy that they're similar to passerines. So passerines are like the songbirds, and 70% of all living species of birds are passerines, and they're small. They're pretty small. Even the largest passerines are pretty small, and they're primarily arboreal. So we can kind of think of this Cretaceous radiation of Enantiornithines as being kind of almost analogous to this modern radiation of passerines. Arboreal means living in trees. Yeah. So scientists, we use a lot of like specialized terminology, but I do kind of like want to like clue people in on like science sounds complicated because we use language that other people aren't familiar with. But basically studying science is about learning that language, like how we describe things scientifically. But it's also really important to remember that when we say an animal is, for example, scansorial, which means climbing, like when we talk about animals this way, we're actually simplifying reality. So like if we would look at a human, for example, we would say we are cursorial, which means we are adapted for like running around on the ground, basically. But the fact is that we can swim and we can climb, we can dig. I mean, digging is fossorial, yeah. So it's important to recognize that science is doing its best to understand the natural world, but in order to study it, we always have to simplify things, and so therefore, we're never really getting the full picture. It's like when we talk about diets, we just like, we're like, oh, this bird's a frugivore, but like most birds that eat fruit eat other things too. So it's like, it's just something that to keep in mind when doing science, because of course we're always trying to be more accurate and try to represent animals better, like more accurately in our studies. But the fact is nature is so incredibly complex that in order to study things, you have to simplify things. And it's just important to remember that when, as a scientist, to remember that you're doing your best, but reality is far more complicated.